Hello, History 150 class. I am back on the mic again, so to speak, with our review on the week looking at resurgence of empire in East Asia. So let's go ahead and start from there. So, why do you think China had such an intense civil service system? And do you think I should institute a Mandarin-style 3-day long essay exam for our final? And I must say, I got more response and feedback on this question than I think I have on any question I've asked so far. And the overwhelming response from the class is that you do not think I should institute a Mandarin-style 3-day long essay exam for our final. So in response to popular demand, I suppose I will stick with our original final exam idea. Although a couple of you were more than willing to go through with the 3-day long exam if it meant you got a PhD at the end of it. But unfortunately, I do not have the power or authority to grant or bestow one upon you. So we'll stick with our original exam idea. How does that sound? But more to why China had such kind of an intense civil service system is because they really put such a premium on trying to get high quality administrators into these bureaucratic positions. And really, this gets back to the incredible amount of diversity that China had and just the need because of the large population size, the large number of ethnic groups, the large diversity in geography within China that all comes together, and that really, if it's going to be run under one individual in the form of the emperor or one governing system, the emperor's government, you needed to have these varying levels of administration to really try to make sure everything was going to run properly. So that you had these Mandarin officials on the local level up to kind of more of a regional level, all the way up to the national level. And that really this very integrated bureaucratic system ended up developing, and that the main way that it was able to be sustained was the fact that they actually took a lot of time and put a lot of emphasis and trying to get really qualified applicants and really qualified individuals who studied Confucian principles and studied the entire ideas that pretty much the state system was based around, to try to make sure that they were going to be qualified and continue to run the country in a way that had proven successful, in times prior to this. So that's certainly one of the ways I think that you can look back at and see the large number of level of success that China ended up having. Was really thanks to the fact that they were willing to take such an intensive process of trying to get intelligent, well-meaning, educated individuals into these positions of administrative power, and not just having it divided up and broken down into royally appointed kings or governors, and making those positions hereditary, like you see ending up happening in a lot of the empires that we've talked about throughout history up until this point in time, in which case it's very easy for stability to be disrupted, for there to be a succession where someone who is not quite as good comes into power, and so forth. So trying to make this entire nation-wide system run very smoothly. And the fact that they took so much time into making sure that was right, I think has a large amount to do with why China was able to maintain itself in more or less kind of a very similar cultural formation for such a long period of time. And of course, we have our nice pictures here of the civil service examinations. So probably question number 2, why do you think China was able to become so multicultural and accepting of foreign religions, ideas, and beliefs? And this is really what our document exercise went towards talking about quite a bit in our class today, or for this week, I should say. And really, I think you can base a lot of it looking at the strong tradition of the combination of Confucianism and Taoism in earlier Chinese traditions, right? And how kind of Confucianism, although it was a philosophy, it wasn't quite a religion. There was no, real deity associated with it, and it was much more a social ideology and a social philosophy and how the ideal society should run, which ultimately left a lot of room for there to be religious aspects that were added in on top of that. And it certainly was not exclusionary, and that's why Taoism worked so well in conjunction with Confucianism for so many years, as we talked about earlier in the class. And ultimately, I think this really goes back once more to kind of the multicultural idea. It's really easy, I think, to look at China and Chinese history and think of the country or the area of China as being just kind of this large conglomeration of people who shared the same culture and were exactly the same. And that's very untrue. That China has an incredible amount of diversity in it, incredible amount of different ethnic groups, different languages being spoken, different cultural traditions, and that really the leniency that an idea like Confucianism would allow there to be still room and growth of individual and local cultures, I think is pretty important and really does speak to the fact that, you know, as time goes on and more religious ideas become entered into China from external areas such as Nestorian Christianity or Islam through trade and commerce and so forth, that it was once more just another layer of this kind of very multicultural society that China was already had up until this point in time. So it was certainly nothing new or nothing different for them to incorporate new traditions and new ideas, and particularly when we're talking about the introduction and the spread of Buddhism, which becomes incredibly important, during this time period and moving forward as well. And that, really, there's plenty of room when the underlying kind of social philosophy is Confucianism for there to be these other various religious philosophies that certainly are not tied into the kind of state and the state's power system the way you might have looked at the Roman religion with the Roman Empire, where so much of Rome and its founders and its leaderships was tied around their religious practices. You could make the same kind of argument when you look at the Byzantine Empire and how important Christianity was and how central that was to the ruling of their empire. The Persian empires and Zoroastrianism, how important Zoroastrianism played. Certainly those are all much more religious components that were tied to the state power system, whereas with China, Confucianism was really the ideology most closely tied with the empire, the emperor, and the ruling system, and that allowed for there to be a lot of more religious flexibility underneath them. And I would say also that this entire idea of, the mandate of heaven kind of allowed for this idea of there being multiple perspectives allowed within the country. That kind of through this natural process that the most capable or the most well earning or best meaning is ultimately going to be one that achieves power, but there's plenty of room for these other ideas to be around because if for whatever reason something doesn't work very well at the top, there's plenty of other ideas and ideologies that can potentially rise up to form the new government through the entire mandate of heaven system or process. And you see that happening where there are time periods where people come in who are from different cultural groups or different ethnic groups that end up taking over China, but very quickly adopt the same kind of Confucian model because it still allows them to run and regulate the incredibly large and diverse country while still allowing them to maintain their own religious ideas as well. So I think that's something else that speaks to the long-term success of the country or of the kingdom or empire that we think of as China. Going on to PowerPoint question number 3, why do you think the practice of foot binding was almost exclusively practiced by the upper class? And, really, I think a lot of people hit the nail right on the head with their answer to this question. And, I would say that the most forefront reason is economic reasons. The fact that, most people in China, women were a vitally important part of the economic systems and, needed to work and help in the fields, help with making things around the house, and simply could not afford to be crippled at a young age for the rest of their life because in order to survive, they were going to need to work and help out around the home and around the household. And certainly that played a large part in why only upper class who could afford pretty much to wait and serve a woman who unfortunately had this horrible experience happen to them or thrust upon them, that they could afford to still take care of that individual in a case where in a lower class that was certainly not going to be the case. And certainly I would say there would be some cultural reasons that would go along as well. That part of the entire appeal to it was the fact that they could have that kind of service around them, and that was why it was kind of seen as being to some degree appealing. And it was much more of kind of a cultural reason that went along with it as well, that was sort of a symbol of power and of wealth that you could afford essentially to do that. But ultimately, a very cruel practice, which ended up hurting many women throughout this time period. Looking at question number 4, comparing China to the Roman and Byzantine empires we discussed last week, and what were the most striking similarities and differences that you noticed? Certainly, I would say they were similar in geographic size. I think that's a good point to point out that, essentially the range that both of them were able to create an empire and sustain an empire for was relatively similar. You also see similarity in the emphasis in trade, in commerce, both within and throughout the empire and reaching out as well. You see both the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, and the empires within China all being very interested in trade and commerce and protecting and spreading that throughout the region and through with neighboring peoples as well, and devoting eventually a lot of resources to protecting these trade routes and their avenues to revenue. You can also take a look at the global perspective, really, that both of them had. They both were essentially trying to have the same kind of imperial model of bringing in lots of different cultures and lots of different peoples under pretty much their banner or their heading, and that they were sort of a, for the world that they knew, the largest, most, integrated force within that, and as a part of that, trying to regulate this very kind of large multicultural empires which they had built up around themselves. Certainly, when you look at differences, I would say the largest difference, and the difference which ultimately leads to, I would say, China continuing in a more successful manner than the Roman or the Byzantine Empire, would certainly be the commitment to the bureaucratic systems that China ended up having, as well as allowing that to sort of overlap or overtake the importance of the role of the emperor within their empire. The Roman and the Byzantine empires were often so many times dependent upon having a good ruler at the very top, and that there wasn't a built-up bureaucratic administrating system underneath them to keep things stable, even if the person on the top wasn't necessarily the best ruler or the best leader. And that's what you saw within China. The very large, detailed, bureaucratic Mandarin system allowed there to be fluctuation in the quality of leadership at the top while being able to maintain more or less stability in the country around them. Roman, Byzantium, and the Byzantine Empire were much more dependent upon having a strong, good ruler. For example, if you look at the rulers talked about last week, they worked very well when you had an Augustus, when you had a Hadrian, when you had a Justinian. But the empires could come into a lot of problems and a lot of issues when there could be a lot of succession problems. Certainly within the Roman Empire, you see stretches of 20 years where we might have 7, 8, 9, 10 emperors throughout that time period, and each of them pretty much ending in some sort of military coup and having just power being transferred, by kind of intrigue and assassinations. And that you certainly see a much more stable ruling system in China. So that even though Rome could operate very well under a very active emperor such as Hadrian, who was actively, going around fulfilling his role as emperor, maintaining the defenses, performing his cultural duties, that, as soon as you got an emperor who was less well suited, or a string of emperors who were all kind of competing, the system could break away relatively quickly. Also, I would say the Roman Empire had more external pressure eventually applied on it through the forms of the Germanic incursions. Certainly there was a long tradition of that within China as well, but it seemed like China was able to insulate itself slightly better from their influences from kind of the steppe land region than you saw happening in Rome and eventually the Byzantine Empire as well. So a little comparison there. Certainly far more you could take a look at as far as the importance of religion and religious philosophy. We kind of already covered that earlier under question number 2, as well as a plethora of other cultural factors you could look at as far as differences go. But just a brief rundown of some of the ones I wanted to point out here. Looking at question number 5, despite never entering into an industrial revolution, China remained the wealthiest and most powerful civilization on Earth until the 1800s, and what factors led to this success? Certainly, looking at the large population size of China always had a lot to do with this, because in the pre-industrial world, really the only way to increase productivity was through increasing population. There's a direct corollary between the two. So China remained the most productive empire and location in the world up to this point in time. However, it was only allowed or really maintained itself in that way because of the stability that came along. And that's one of the main reasons I've been pointing that out throughout these questions and throughout the PowerPoints, is that really being able to tie in these various traditions and these various cultures within China into a larger state system for such a long period of time is what allowed China to become as productive as they ultimately were under this very shared kind of ideology, which was able to become open to and incorporating of many cultural and religious traditions within it. Also, then taking that production and becoming a center of trade and commerce, and pretty much being the largest trading power in the world up until the 1800s, certainly influenced the amount of wealth and power that they were able to accumulate for themselves, and really the role that they played, particularly in the Silk Road trading systems and the Indian Ocean trading systems, and maintaining themselves as really the most significant economic factor in those very vibrant trading networks. Was another factor that led to them really being the kind of the center of the cultural world up until that time period. And it's really no surprise that as time goes on, some of the most important inventions that we see, particularly having an impact in Europe, are developed in China. We talked about it as well throughout this PowerPoint. If you look at the introduction of the printing press, that was invented in China, the compass, gunpowder, all of these inventions that are going to have kind of a big impact on the world stage as we go into kind of the second portion of this class. From 1500 to the present, a lot of those inventions were developed within China, and I don't think it's any coincidence that is the case, seeing as how, like I said, they had this pretty much the longest running tradition and most stable with the most productivity, all wrapped around this very kind of solid ideology for such a long period of time. Okay, switching over then to our document exercise, which really exemplifies a lot of portions of question number 2 that we were looking at and that we were seeing. For example, this first little snippet here, you see the incorporation of Buddhism into China as well as Japan. And I think this quote that a number of people use to kind of show the interconnectivity between these various areas was this first one. The Holy See will be a seat where all men of the 3 countries, India, China, and Japan, and the whole Jambudvipa world will be initiated into the mysteries, or the ideas and the practices of Buddhism. So it's the idea that it's kind of once more sort of a widespread kind of international religion at this point in time, operating in various countries and various locations, and ultimately you see Buddhism in particular becoming more entrenched and ingrained in Japan and in China than you do in India, which always, of course, itself had many competing religious traditions as well. In this first little picture here, you can really see the time and the effort that went into creating these large Buddhist temples and how important it was for the people at that point in time. And the sponsorship that went along with it, not just by the local communities, but oftentimes by the state as well, as the Chinese government, because it had that very solid Confucian underlying, was never really threatened by external religious ideas in the same way that you might have seen in areas such as the Roman Empire, in some certain cases within the kingdoms of India, and so forth. But you really see the best example of that in our next document when we're talking about the establishment of the Nestorian Church here. And I think this first quote, a lot of people used it, is very, very telling, that right principles have no invariable name, holy men have no invariable station, instruction is established in accordance with the locality and with the object of benefiting people at large. So once more, this idea that China was much more willing to look at the beneficial sides of a religion and the impact that it could have, and that as long as the principles were pretty much in accordance with the other religions that were already operating, there was nothing real kind of extreme or anything that was going to outright hurt the society around them. They were more than willing to look at it and support it. And certainly in this next line down here, they did that with Nestorian Christianity and said, having examined the principles of this religion, we find them to be purely excellent and natural. And I think China was able to really look at the fact that a lot of religions, and you see Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam all forming relatively large and important aspects within China, that these religions, for the most part, had a lot more in common than they did difference. And you can take a look at pretty much most of the large religions in world history, and a lot of them actually do have a lot more in common than they have in difference. I hope that's one of the things that you have been able to see and observe throughout our class period here. And that as long as they were not going to be competing with themselves or creating problems within the empire, China was more than willing to support a wide number of various ideologies and religious ideas and practices, because they really realize that a lot of them are going to be having these positive impacts and positive side effects. And as long as the negative impacts that can potentially come along with religion, the exclusive aspects of it, the competition, and the violence which can occur around them as well, as long as those are not being brought to the forefront, China is more than willing to support them. And we certainly see these in various locations. For example, the granting of portraits of the empire or the emperor into the church itself. And certainly with all these religions operating in China, you see Chinese culture having an impact on them as well. This is just the cultural practices of cultural borrowing and dissemination, that when cultures, religious or otherwise, come into contact with another, they're invariably going to have an impact. And that the religions within China, whether they're Christian, Islamic, or Buddhist, ultimately all end up taking a rather Chinese bent or flavor to them to one degree or another. And you can certainly see that when you look down at the examples of the mosques down below us here, where they're all incorporating various aspects of Chinese architecture, but as well more traditional Islamic architecture as well, with the arches here, for example. You can see in this one with the more Chinese-looking doors and styles. So certainly another example, and I would say in these pictures as well, that China was more than willing to be supportive of these religions, because you don't have these very large, beautiful, intricate temples being created and sustained if there's not going to be some amount of support from it from the large governing systems around it. And you see that continuously throughout the Nestorian Christianity document as well. That empire also composing moats or kind of inscriptions for the sides of the church, the tables of grace with royal inscriptions, the accumulated gems emitted their effulgence. So pretty much, creating or allowing these churches to be very beautifully built and made, and kind of becoming a benefactor of a wide range and of different religious institutions and places of worship throughout their empire. These are all things that the Chinese government was more than willing to do. So there you have it. Thanks again for listening to another review. I hope you had a good week. And of course, as always, if you have any questions about your grades or the material or my commentary or anything else, please feel free to let me know. Other than that, I hope you have a great